Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Man, if you blinked last week, you might have missed like a whole roller coaster in the market.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
You saw that scary dip in early April, all that tariff stuff from Trump.
Oh, yeah.
And then boom, April 9th hits. And it's like the market just did a complete 180.
Total.
Huge jump across the board. So for this deep dive, we're going to really try to figure out what is going on with these tariffs, especially this whole U.S. versus China thing.
Oh, yeah.
We've been looking at a bunch of different angles. We got like a financial guy on YouTube, this guy Kupta breaking down the numbers.
You're right.
So let's get into it. So what exactly did Trump announce that kicked all this off?
Well, the big news seems to be that Trump declared like a 90-day timeout on tariffs for a whole bunch of countries.
Oh, wow.
Over 75, they're saying. But here's the catch. This break was specifically for countries that didn't hit back with their own tariffs against the U.S.
Okay, so it's like rewarding the countries that played along?
Right.
But then he really cranked up the heat on China, right?
Yeah.
I saw those tariffs on Chinese goods jumped way up to 125% almost overnight. That's massive.
It is a very significant hike, and Trump went straight to Truth Social to kind of make his point.
Oh, yeah.
Saying China played wrong and is panicking, claiming they can't afford this. It's about as direct as you can get.
Yeah, no beating around the bush there.
Nope.
And China wasn't exactly thrilled about that, were they?
Not really.
We saw reports they bumped up their tariffs on U.S. goods to 84%.
Yeah.
So it's like a trade war throwing punches back and forth.
Exactly. And this is where we start to see like different takes on the strategy.
Okay.
We heard Treasury Secretary Benson suggesting that Trump's whole aggressive move is about creating maximum negotiating leverage.
I see.
Like putting someone in a corner to get them to agree to your terms.
Some old school tactics.
Oh, yeah.
Like how barons used to operate, or even a mafia tactic. Just apply so much pressure that the other side has to cave.
Right.
It's a pretty dramatic way to look at it, but it kind of paints a picture of the kind of pressure Trump is trying to exert.
It definitely highlights the shock value of this approach. And the initial reaction was quite something.
Yeah.
That the Dow Jones shot up over 2,300 points, a 6.2% jump.
Wow.
The S&P 500 went up 7%, its biggest single-day gain since the dot-com era. And the NASDAQ up 8.6%, also a dot-com record.
Yeah, you see those numbers and you think, okay, maybe this whole tariff thing isn't a disaster after all. But then you have to wonder, is this 90-day pause a real sign that things are calming down?
Right.
Or is it just a temporary break before more fireworks?
That's the big question. Is this a genuine step back from broad trade conflict, or is it a strategic move to focus even more intensely on China? Which brings us to this idea of China played wrong. The feeling that the U.S. is now really zeroing in on isolating China economically.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
He did.
Saying with so many other countries now talking with the U.S.,
right,
China's kind of the last one standing in strong opposition.
Yeah, it's like they're making deals with everyone else and leaving China out in the cold. And there's a clear economic argument being made to back this up.
Okay.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent argued that China has the most imbalanced economy in the history of the modern world.
Wow.
And that these tariffs are ultimately bad news for them. He pointed out that the U.S. buys about 5 times as much from China as China buys from the U.S.
That's a huge difference. So the thinking is China relies way more on selling stuff to Americans than we rely on selling stuff to them, which makes them more vulnerable to tariffs.
It's like if your biggest customer suddenly stops buying My Chance, you're going to feel it way more than if a smaller customer leaves. Once tariffs get above a certain level, say around 50%, increasing them even higher to 84% or 125%, might not have that much more of an extra bite.
Oh, I see.
The initial damage is already significant.
So the U.S. might be thinking, we've already hit them pretty hard, so any retaliation from them isn't going to hurt us as much.
Could be.
It's a pretty calculated, if aggressive, move.
It is. The U.S. believes other countries are eager to negotiate.
Okay.
Because they really need access to the huge American market and American consumers. We buy a lot of stuff and other countries want to sell it to us.
Makes sense. Everyone wants a piece of the pie.
Right.
While the U.S. buys a lot from China, American consumers have gotten used to those lower prices.
That's true.
So there's definitely a connection there that can't be ignored. It's not like we won't feel any pain at all if Chinese goods become more expensive.
That's a critical point.
Yeah.
Disrupting the supply chains and potentially leading to higher prices for everyday goods is a real risk.
Yeah.
Part of Trump's strategy might be to shake up European trade.
Interesting.
Maybe to make it harder for them to negotiate against the U.S. as a united front.
So it's not just about China.
Right.
But also about reshaping the whole global trade setup to benefit the U.S.
Okay, so we've talked about the main tariff stuff and this U.S. versus China angle. What else did our sources bring up that we haven't gotten to yet? What other things should our listeners be aware of?
Well, there were a couple of interesting developments.
Okay.
A potential LG project in Alaska.
Okay.
Which is being talked about as like a positive outcome of these trade talks.
Yeah.
It would involve money from South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan.
That sounds like a concrete win.
It does.
At least potentially. Something more than just tariffs going up and down.
Right.
It shows how these negotiations can open doors for other deals. Whether the U.S. might consider kicking Chinese companies off of U.S. stock exchanges as another way to cut off funding for China's military.
Wow, that would be a really big move. Cutting off their access to American investment money would definitely have a major impact.
It would.
And then there was the concern about the U.S. bond market.
Right.
The worry isn't just about China maybe selling off U.S. bonds, but also about American investors potentially doing the same.
Yeah, that affects the stability of our own financial system.
Sue actually explained that a bit.
Oh, it did?
Connecting it to what happens with hedge funds. Apparently, when the stock market drops really fast, some of these investment funds that borrow money might be forced to sell off other assets like bonds to cover their losses.
Right. It shows how interconnected different parts of the financial world are.
It does.
And how a big swing in one area can cause ripples in others.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got the expert breakdown. Now let's take a look at what some folks who are watching all this had to say in the comments.
Okay.
We saw some interesting reactions. Someone named Harlan at 655 simply said that China is in an awkward position. Which seems to sum up that whole idea of them being isolated right now.
It's a short and sweet way to capture the potential difficulty China might be facing.
Then Aiku7 had a more political take.
Oh.
Suggesting that China's needs might be less important to them than their bigger political goals, like becoming more open and wealthier.
I see.
Basically, they might be willing to take some economic pain for those larger ambitions.
That's an important point to consider. Economic decisions at a national level aren't always just about dollars and cents. Political strategy often plays a big role.
Tongyi brought up the question of who can handle the costs of this trade standoff for longer, pointing out that China doesn't have elections and citizen input in the same way that Trump has a limited time in office. It makes you think about how different political systems might respond to long-term economic pressure.
A very insightful observation. The way each country's political system works could definitely influence how long they can sustain economic hardship.
On a lighter note, someone called Kanpiku made a funny comment about seeing more of Trump on the news this year than their own dad, which, you know, with Trump constantly in the headlines, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that feeling. And then we had some more colorful commentary.
Oh.
Williking8989 sarcastically suggested 100% tariffs on Hassan's hummus, which I'm guessing is just a random product to highlight how absurd these escalating tariffs can seem.
It's a way to express a bit of frustration with the whole thing, perhaps.
Finally, Really Ace expressed some skepticism about Trump's reliability, saying, this crazy guy has no credibility, doesn't play by the rules, who knows what variables will come up in these 3 months. That really gets at the uncertainty that Trump's approach can create for businesses and markets.
Absolutely.
It's hard to plan when the rules seem to change so suddenly.
The unpredictability of policy can be a significant source of worry for markets and businesses trying to make long-term decisions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Let's try to wrap things up.
Okay.
What are the main things our listeners should take away from this deep dive into Trump's latest tariff moves?
The key takeaways are that Trump has taken a very aggressive approach with tariffs, which has led to a temporary pause for many countries while really increasing the pressure on China. This has created a situation where China seems to be the main target in this trade conflict.
And the market, after that initial dip, seems to have reacted positively to this temporary break with those big jumps we saw on April 9th. But it's crucial to remember that the long-term effects are still really uncertain, both for the economy and for global politics.
Exactly. There are different views on how China can withstand this kind of pressure, both economically and politically. And the potential wider impacts on global trade supply chains and even the U.S. bond market are things that you should continue to watch.
So as we finish up this deep dive, here's a final question for you to think about. Considering how quickly policies and market feelings can change, what are the real long-term signs you should be looking for to understand how this trade situation will ultimately play out? And how might seemingly unrelated global events end up affecting this whole complicated picture? It's definitely not as simple as just looking at the tariff numbers.
It's a complex situation with a lot of moving pieces. And the long-term consequences will likely depend on many interconnected factors.
Absolutely. And on that note, if you need a break from all this heavy stuff, our buddy Micky has a great YouTube channel called Mickytolife. He's got some awesome travel vlogs, reviews, all kinds of whiskey and other drinks, and puts out some really chill background music.
Sounds fun.
Go check him out when you get a chance. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll catch you next time.